Hey there, friends. I hope that you enjoy this episode of the Remembering and Reenchanting podcast as much as I enjoyed making it. I want to take a moment here at the beginning to extend a special offer, an invitation to you, our dear listeners, to join the Remembering course. Our next start date is going to be in middle of March. This is a powerful, deeply moving, and for many people, transformational experience into the heart of colonization, climate change, family histories, ancestors, and so many other critical intersecting pieces. Just visit our website, Sequoia Samanvaya. All the information is in the link below. Hello, and welcome to the Remembering and Reenchanting podcast. My name is Sarah Jolena Wolcott, and I am your hostess on this sacred learning journey of unraveling, unveiling, and becoming more fully alive at the end of the world as we know it. Hello, and welcome to the Remembering and Reenchanting podcast with your hostess, Sarah Jolena Wolcott, that is, myself. I am delighted to be joined today with one of the foremost thinkers and leading scholars on the intersections of religion and nature, Bron Taylor, who is joining us from his office in Florida.
Nice to be with you.
I was actually just going to ask, do you prefer being called Bron or Dr. Taylor?
Just Bron.
Bron is fine. Okay, great. It's really a pleasure having you here. I've known about your work for such a long time. It's influenced many of my colleagues, both academic and practitioners. And you've really kind of, in some ways, set the field for the rest of us to understand where we are in it. I am wondering if we can start this conversation with understanding a bit more about where you come from. We can ask the question, how did you get into what we are calling dark green religion? But it seems like it might also be makes sense to start a little bit further back and say, how did you get into this field to begin with?
Sure. Well, I'll try to abbreviate a long pilgrimage story. I am a Californian. I grew up in Southern California. At the age of 13, I moved to Ventura, California, within walking distance to the beach, and fell for the natural systems there. And I was at the time in a family that was really quite broken, and in some ways, at least emotionally abusive. And I found myself on a number of occasions just kind of gravitating down toward the beach in the middle of the night and looking out over the ocean and seeing the anchovies jumping out there in the moonlight, and just realizing that despite the crazy in my own family, there was just something marvelous in the world and in the universe. So I always had this, from those sorts of experiences, I always had this felt connection, or from then anyway, a deeply felt connection to our natural surrounds. But I also didn't have much adult supervision, and I ended up gravitating, as many young people did at that time, toward the Jesus movement. There were good and caring people in that movement that kind of took me under their wings and provided some guidance at important points. And so I had a number of years as a teenager and until about 20 where I was involved in that movement. And eventually I managed to, after a community college, get to Cal State Chico, where I began taking religious studies classes. And I soon realized that the form of Christianity that I was familiar with, evangelical Christianity, which is religiously and politically conservative in the main, was far from the only form of Christianity. So I began to learn about liberation theology, the efforts to fuse kind of leftist political analysis with the prophetic tradition in Judaism and Christianity, which led to priests and lay people getting uppity in Latin America, South Africa, and Southeast Asia, promoting social justice causes. And I was moved by those movements and drawn to them. And I began to realize that religion can be a tremendous catalyst for social change, even while at the same time, quite obviously, as Marx suggested, religion is often the opiate of the people. It dulls people to the pain of their suffering and obscures the ways in which they are being oppressed. So eventually I went to seminary, an evangelical seminary. I studied liberation theology there, and from there went to get a PhD in social ethics at the University of Southern California. And I was moving out of the Christian tradition at that time, but I remained very interested in the power of religion, both for good and ill. And I thought that I would go to Latin America somewhere to study those liberation movements, but I couldn't afford to, as many graduate students will relate to how what they choose for their graduate work is can be shaped by economics. And I happened to be fortunate, having moved to the beach, to develop some marine skills and became an ocean lifeguard for California State Parks. And before long, I was drafted into the participate and help with the Equal Employment Opportunity Committee within my department.
Within the state, so this was within the state parks.
That's right. That's right. And they asked me to help them develop curricula for their affirmative action and anti-discrimination programs, and to teach those programs to rangers, lifeguards, and other state park personnel, which I did. And that provided access to leadership of the department. And I was able to get them to agree to let me talk on the clock to many departmental employees. And from that, I developed some survey research, which helped me to wrestle with those policies, those affirmative action and anti-discrimination policies. And that became eventually emerged as my first book, Affirmative Action at Work, Law, Politics, and Ethics. So I was deeply engaged in kind of social justice activism, both as an activist and also as an intellectual, trying to push forward policies that, as difficult and as ambivalent as we might be about them, I thought were ethically permissible, especially at that time.
And that gave you a really, I imagine it gave you a really kind of powerful window of understanding organizations and organizational development, and how organizations and structures can change or not change.
Well, absolutely. And in fact, I had a long pacifist phase, and I had turned from that based on what I had read from the liberation theologians, who talked about how that was often a very privileged position compared to those who are struggling for basic survival against plutocracies and violent authoritarian regimes. And because I was very interested in the question of violence and how to promote more peaceful societies, I actually, when I became a permanent employee with the state parks, I also became a state park peace officer. And I did that because I thought that if I'm going to be an ethicist, which is my training, it's best not to do that from an ivory tower, but on the ground, where you're wrestling with the very real struggles that we're engaged in urban parks in Southern California along the beaches, trying to protect people and the park itself. So that was a really valuable experience. I'm not a very naive person, as I think many academicians are, as a result of doing that work. But I also had this feeling when doing the affirmative action work and looking at philosophical and religious ethics as they promoted social justice, I had a deep sense that there was something missing, given the earlier experiences of connection with the natural world, and a growing awareness that it was under severe assault by our own species. So I started to wonder about, well, where's the liberation of nature? And then I began to discover, oh, well, there are a few Christians that are writing about this. John Cobb wrote a book on the liberation of life. Rosemary Ruther wrote Women, oh gosh, I'm forgetting the exact name, New Woman, New Earth.
That's right.
I think in 1975. And so I began to gravitate toward to try to figure out, well, what's the possibility that religion might inspire pro-environmental behavior as well as pro-social justice behavior. And then in the late 80s, as I was wrapping up my PhD work, I began to notice efforts to sabotage the Barstow to Las Vegas desert race and to protect endangered bighorn sheep on the east side of California in the mountains there. And I learned that the activists doing that called themselves Earth First. And I learned that they had been around since 1980. And I began to get their tabloids because I was intrigued by this. And I discovered that there was a lot of spiritual stuff going on under that umbrella that was entirely new to me. I mean, I had been more in this kind of Abrahamic religion milieu, not the kind of nature spirituality, let alone pagan milieu.
And it wasn't something you were seeing in state parks, like their ethos and the ethics that they were ascribing to wasn't something you would have seen in a state park.
Well, we see a lot in the state parks. So we see some people coming in to engage in ritualizing in the parks, like the Hare Krishnas and so forth. But nothing that, and I was aware that some of my park colleagues, in the very interviews that I was doing about affirmative action, we would talk about not just those policies, but that some of those folks were saying, if I saw some of those eco-radicals challenging the extractive industries, I'd look the other way. And these are law enforcement officers, because they had sympathies. A lot of the folks that are drawn to the parks, even if they end up as LEOs, law enforcement officers, they have pro-nature sentiments that they often also understand as spiritual. Now, as it happened, I, to my shock, got an academic job in Wisconsin right after getting my PhD. And Dave Foreman, who had recently been arrested, the most charismatic of the founders of Earth First, showed up at my campus, invited by others. But I, by that time, in the spring of 1990, spring of 1989, I had already been bird dogging the movement, reading their tabloids, and knew a good bit about them just from the articles they produced and articles about these wild people. So I arranged to meet with him, interview him. I introduced him. I had him and what I call the feral ones over to my house afterward, who had come from the neighboring regions to hear him speak. And I was, from that experience, I just knew that there was something really profoundly spiritual going on in those movements that I needed to know more about. And I could tell, and I wrote an article that I think was published in 91 in what was then the most widely published, distributed and translated journal in the world, The Ecologist. And I published an article called The Religion and Politics of Earth First. And that was my first effort to wrestle with the movement, which is based largely on my reading of their documentary materials. And I realized there was kind of three major pillars to their ethics. And the first was a deeply spiritual biocentrism, the perception that all life has value apart from its usefulness to human beings. The second pillar was that human beings are precipitating an egregiously wrong extinction crisis. And the third was that politics, as usual, was not up to the task of ameliorating that crisis, and therefore extra-legal tactics are warranted including civil disobedience, but not just civil disobedience, also including sabotage when strategically employed to thwart human extractive and other behaviors that are driving other species off the planet. Mm. Now, obviously, given my background, I was neither an anarchist nor a hippie. But so I wanted, and I've used the movement as kind of a muse to think about environmental ethics and environmental social movements. I didn't, for example, when I first was reading their material, I didn't know whether to believe that humans were creating a massive extinction episode. So I became engrossed with reading far more from the environmental sciences than I had previously. Mm-hmm. And I also wasn't convinced that extra-legal tactics were morally justified or effective. And so I began to study particular cases where these folks were making those claims and engaging in activism to try to reverse and or prevent environmental harms. And kind of grudgingly, I came to understand that they were right. They were making accurate statements about the anthropogenic, the human-caused extinction crisis, and that indeed resource regimes in North America and certainly elsewhere in the world were also profoundly corrupt. That really the lawlessness had been going on for a long time, and the best of the people in this movement were getting out on the land, well aware of what the laws were, documenting how the government was looking the other way as many corporations, logging companies, mining companies were egregiously violating the law and imperiling species. So I found myself sympathetic to the overall arguments, even though I think at times there were many problems internally within these movements, which I've written about, and there were, as with any kind of extremism, there are times when people are going too far and they lose nuance in their own judgments and so forth. Mm-hmm. So I've tried to find a way to incorporate in my own thinking the values and the insights of the movement while issuing criticisms and cautions about the excesses that sometimes adhere to them. Now, so the other things that I'll say one more thing about how this movement turned out to be a muse for me, and that is that they had a particular perception of what was going on beyond the borders of the USA. And I wanted to test that perception. And that's what led to the Ecological Resistance Movements book, where with others, we looked at green social movements, especially radical ones around the world, and at their spiritual dimensions. And ultimately, that work kept growing into what became the Dark Green Religion book and argument.
Oh, interesting. So it started from looking at the social and at these social activism, ecological activism movements globally, and you began to see. Okay, that makes sense, because in the beginning of the book, you're talking a lot about some of those earth activism spaces, but you're talking about the spiritual movements within them, the way in which they're describing it, not in a secular context, but in a profoundly spiritual context.
Yeah, I mean, the North American activists, not just North American, but Australian and activists, all other Earth First activists who joined the cause, so to speak, in the 80s and 90s, they had a view of green social movements abroad, and they viewed them as kindred spirits. Mm-hmm. And I wasn't sure that was the case. Where people are getting uppity in South America, for example, on these issues, were they motivated in the same sorts of eco-spiritual ways that many of the North American, Australian, and Western European activists were? And we found, on the one hand, that there were that a lot of times these movements in the South were driven as much, if not more, in defense of livelihoods than being based in kind of deep ecological intrinsic value of nature theories.
Mm.
But over time, I also began to see that many of them were indeed did have similar kind of spiritual, what I've sometimes called spiritualities of belonging and connection to nature, were also a part of many of those movements and their most ardent activists. And I've been privileged over a number of decades now to travel to, really many places in the world, including under United Nations venues where people are engaged with trying to address our environmental predicaments. And I began to notice some of the same patterns widely scattered around the world that I first really encountered under the radical environmental umbrella.
Can you spell
just,
out what some of those patterns were?
Yeah, sure. Well, for example, in the Dark Green Religion book, I say that there's a number of characteristics that are typical in what I construct as dark green religion. A perception that nature is sacred, its value is not only indirect by virtue of having been divinely created, and thus all living things have value and deserve respect and reverence. Another common idea is that all life forms share a common ancestor, and therefore all organisms are kin. We are biologically related, which leads to moral and ethical responsibilities toward them. Also common is an ecology-based understanding that all life is interconnected and mutually dependent. And then, as I indicated a minute ago, these spiritualities are typically characterized by deep feelings of belonging and connection to nature, but also they tend to involve a corresponding humility about the human place in the world. And then, of course, these kinds of folks have often traced their green perceptions to experiences of awe and wonder at the terror, beauties, and wonders of the world and the universe, in a way that's not uncommon to my own early experiences that helped me cope with my family dysfunctions.
Yeah, there's a strong sense of a direct experience with the awe and the wonder and the kinship. That's a really critical
absolutely.
piece of it.
And many of these things basically can be understood to fall under the idea of a love of and for nature and all living things. So these are experiences, and these are the core attributes that we find in what I've called dark green spirituality around the world. And I argued in the book that such spiritualities have been growing rapidly around the world. That for many people, everything began to change when Darwin published On the Origin of Species in 1859. And then as the power of that explanation for the world's diversity was buttressed by what we now know based on DNA analysis, which reinforces the idea that we all share a common ancestor, these kinds of kinship spiritualities have gained even more traction wherever people are relatively well educated. So this is what I've talked about in the book, and part of what's been interesting has been the reception of the book. It's now been translated into German, it's in process in Mandarin and Italian, and parts have been translated into Spanish, and it was going to be translated into Russian until my Russian translator got driven out of Kiev. Maybe that'll still happen. But what that indicates to me is that what I identified in the book strikes a chord with many people from around the world. And indeed, part of what I said in the book is that if I'm not crazy, readers will be able to identify in their own contexts examples of what I'm talking about, often, if not usually, phenomena that I know nothing about. And that has also been the case. People writing to me and saying, giving me examples of things I don't know about that fit this kind of analysis. And people also writing and saying, basically saying, thanks for putting this together, because now I don't feel so alone. I kind of thought that me and my few friends, who have these kinds of feelings, perceptions, and values, were really outliers, but now I can see I'm part of a global upswelling of kind of eco-spiritual moral concern.
And you really do. I mean, I really like those folks. I feel a tremendous appreciation for the extent to which you are looking at a very wide spectrum of people. So most, you're not trying to define it by who. You're using a different analytical lens than is often used in terms of like tracking identity formations. You, as you
Mm-hmm.
mentioned, are talking about radical environmentalists, but you're also talking about scientists, from physicists to biologists to anthropologists. You're looking at cinema and popular nature movies, Avatar being a particularly famous one, but you're also looking at the powerful documentaries of Attenborough. And you're looking at wildlife encounters that are then subsequently depicted in film and art and video, at Gaia theories, systems theories, at arts and photography, and in ways in which people are connecting through museums, aquariums, and other forms of spaces, protected spaces that enable some sort of direct encounter with nature, as well as with international NGOs and such as the United Nations and even some corporations. So it's a very wide, it's a very wide angle lens that you're taking in that.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, as
Yeah.
yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I'm glad you mentioned that. That's a nice kind of overview of the kinds of phenomena that I analyze in the book. It's far from only the so-called eco-radicals who have these kinds of feelings and perceptions and values. Indeed, there's a host of ways in which people are experiencing, evoking, expressing, and promoting these kinds of spiritualities. And much of this is taking place in the arts and sciences, as you suggest.
Arts
I
and
mean,
sciences, and also within the context of organizations, which I think is quite
yeah,
fascinating because it's a place that people often find themselves and don't think of that's a place to look for spiritual
right,
dynamics, but I think it absolutely is a place where many people who are embedded in institutions are taking this and trying to play with it and trying to work with it. And then you also give like you're not putting this in an ahistorical context. You're looking at
right.
like the kind of very real ways in which people are drawing upon different historical thinkers, especially Thoreau and Emerson, John Muir, Thomas Berry, Aldo Leopold. So, and these are often associated as great environmental thinkers, but you kind of reread their texts and find the spiritual and animist and religious qualities in those texts and how they have informed the soulful approach as well as an kind of more classically assumed to be secular approach to
That's right.
environmentalism.
And it's good that you mentioned the animistic dimension of these perceptions and feelings. One of the things I work with a good bit is animist perception, and also what's increasingly called Gaian spirituality or Gaian worldviews, which is another way to talk about an ancient perception that's until recently has been usually called organicism. The idea that the world is a interconnected, mutually dependent whole. And those perceptions are increasingly buttressed by the sciences. So, through time, people have arrived at those kinds of perceptions without modern science, but now they're buttressed in many ways by the sciences. The discipline of ethology, the study of animal consciousness and behavior, reinforces the fact that of evolutionary continuity between our own species and all other species. So we know that there's a lot more going on in the cognitive and emotional lives of animals, for example, or many animals that resembles our own cognitive and emotional lives, even if we shouldn't be arrogant about the extent to which that's the case. The barrier that has long prevented us in the West from thinking about these things of, the cardinal sin of anthropomorphism is eroding in the face of these sciences. And then with regard to Gaia theory, even though the theory itself is not widely accepted by environmental scientists in the form that it was articulated by James Lovelock and Lynn Margulis as a metaphor for ecological interdependency, which is widely accepted by science. It's a brilliant one, because
Mhm.
it's like George Lakoff says, it's sticky in the mind. And the trope animism is sticky in the mind, even though it has a colonial history that has led some scholars to say we shouldn't even use the term. The fact is
Yeah,
that the term has gone native and
it,
people use it and apply it to their own sense of the personhood, value, and exotic intelligences of other species.
I'm seeing more and more people self-identify as animist just in the last, I feel like last 5 or 10 years, which I think is quite interesting. I
It
don't
is indeed.
recall seeing that as like identification marker earlier. And I'm kind of actually curious about how so you distinguish in your book between um, the greening of religions. So, for example, um, the sense of that in a world religion such as Islam or Christianity, the sense of an obligation to an ethos towards environmental care and sustainability within that religious tradition, and dark green religion, which is not necessarily attached to a global religion and has a sort of a set of assumptions behind it, particularly political assumptions behind it, that often can jive with the greening of global religions, but is also distinct from. Um, and then you also talk about animism and paganism as aspects. I'm kind of curious about how, like currently in your current thinking, as you've been thinking about some of these definitions and how terms are evolving, how are you like just to like distinguish between green religions, uh, the greening of religious, like global religions, and this sort of dark green religion,
Sure, sure.
eco-spirituality, and animism a little bit. Like, how are these terms and understandings, how do you see them evolving?
Well, one reason that I got drawn to this, what was then a nascent field of religion and nature, or religion and ecology, was because I knew that sometimes religions can lead to dramatic mobilization to face the great challenges of the day, as they did in the civil rights movement. So I was
Mhm.
kind of hopeful about that. Um, Over the decades, however, when I look at the world's predominant religions and look at them in a hard-headed way empirically, although we see ardent environmentalists emerge in all of these traditions, some more than others, but um, folks clearly trying to move their own traditions in a much more dramatic green direction, we see that they're having a really hard time doing that.
Mm.
And some of those
Can
folks
you give an
would
example of that?
have
Just
affinity with, yeah, sure. Well, some of those folks, by the way, would have affinity with many of those basic ideas that are articulated in dark green religion, but some of those would be viewed as spiritually or politically dangerous to some orthodox religionists in these traditions. So your question again was
um, so it's
an
well,
example?
yeah, an example of like, because I totally resonate with
Sure.
that, but just to kind of help the listener like hear a bit more clearly. Um, and this has been my experience as well, the extent to which it has been a very significant struggle for those religious environments within a global religious tradition to push that religious tradition to become more ecologically sensitive.
Right. Um, your listeners who might want to get introduced to the empirical research that I and others have done to review a wide range of scholarly work in this area, they could Google the ecological citizen. There's kind of popular versions of longer scholarly articles that I and others have produced, and they could just search my name under the ecological citizen, or they can go to my website and find the long versions of what I call the greening of religion hypothesis. And there's two parts to that study. One is looking at the historical emergence of the ferment over religion and ecology relationships. And the second is a comprehensive review of research. So here's just a few ideas why it's hard, kind of like Kermit the Frog talking about how hard it is to be green.
Mm.
It's hard for the world's predominant religions to be green. And there's a number of reasons for that that are completely understandable on a human level. Well, one is that all these religions emerged in the context of agricultures. And agricultures depend on protecting their domesticated plants and animals from predators of all sorts. So these religions typically don't have fond attitudes toward organisms that compete with them in some way for their food. If you look at the Abrahamic religions, for example, they don't, even in some of these beautiful passages about, in the Hebrew Bible about the lion lying down with the lamb. Well, they don't want the lion to be a lion. They want the lion to be okay with not eating the lamb. When St. Francis, who is viewed as the in the Christian tradition, is viewed by some Christians as kind of the paragon ecological saint, and indeed he's after Lynn White suggested he become the patron saint of ecology, Pope John Paul II, if memory serves, made him the patron saint for ecologists. Well, one of the great legends about Francis is that he converted the wolf Gubbio into basically a domesticated dog that took food from humans rather than, which basically reversed his own ontology, his own beingness as a social hunter with other wolves. So that's not a perspective that respects the wolf as wolf. The same thing is the case in religions that originated in the Indian subcontinent. Great saints are said to have tamed tigers so that they would not predate on human food sources or humans. And that's just a couple of examples. I just read a great book that goes into that in great depth, looking at tigers and snakes and so forth, and how negatively they were viewed. So that's part of it. But there are other ideas.
And just so that,
yeah,
like in your book, Dark Green Religion, like you go into like actually how understanding the human as prey is actually a critical part of a lot of people's spiritual revelatory experience, that they see themselves as part of the natural world, not only as friend to the tiger or the bear, but as a being that can potentially be eaten, and that actually reconceptualizes where the human is in the larger cosmovision. So like what you're just describing here is like a very important part of like, what is our place in the world? It's not simply like a question of defending, an older agricultural settlement, but like, are we prey, or are we trying to move away from that kind of very ancient relationship with predators?
Yes, excellent point. Are we fully part of it, or are we somehow superior to it? And is our ultimate destiny, does the religion ultimately promise divine rescue from this world, or does a religion embrace the idea that the world as it is miraculous and sacred, and we're a part of it, and we can revel in that? And even while there's sadness when one of our loved ones passes on, we can accept that, because that we know that is also the wellspring of new life, as our being is recycled into other forms of life.
And that people's, and you detail several of these different experiences that people have had and written and made movies about, in which their experience as prey and their experience with predators is itself part of the spiritual milieu, which shifts how they relate to themselves and to others, which is a really, like, in terms of the variety of religious experiences, like to really, what does it mean for a religious community to incorporate those experiences into its mystical tradition?
See, religions, the world's predominant religions, promise people that they can live forever, either in some place apart from the world, or through continued cycles of rebirth, based on one's meritorious, whether one has lived a meritorious life in the existing cycle. Whereas these dark green spiritualities have a kind of a different view of the human in the cycles of life. Not that they're going to somehow escape from the world, but they are so fully a part of it that they accept that and come to embrace it. And this, of course, is often reinforced by the sciences and what happens to a body after death.
And it's also like as you're describing that, I'm thinking about many of the conversations I support people in, um, working with mortality, be that the mortality of the individual, the mortality of an organization, and the potential mortality of the civilization as an antidote to perpetual growth and a limitless growth paradigm, like becomes a really important part of how people and organizations, it's not just individuals, but of how organizations and individuals like see their own role and their own place, their own cosmovision. Like the role of mortality becomes critical in the cosmovision that you're articulating. Any cosmovision, mortality is always like, what is the role of death? But
Yeah,
there's an antidote there to limitless growth on a material plane.
yeah, that's a good point as well. I mean, these sorts of things indicate why, for someone who has a modern kind of modern ecological understanding, why some of even while you might value parts of the kind of uh, even while you might appreciate the insights that are embedded in the world's predominant religions, and there are many, you might just say, well, they didn't get everything right. And they certainly didn't know about, they didn't know Darwin's theory. They didn't know, when they were originating, they didn't know about a host of ecological principles. And so what happens is that well-educated people tend to find implausible the metaphysical truth claims, whether they emerged on the Indian subcontinent or in the ancient Near East. So what do you do then? It's not like the quest for meaning, purpose, and existential comfort goes away, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that people who have such modern understandings, they are tending to gravitate toward those who are expressing such, providing worldviews that provide meaning, purpose, existential comfort, and some of the great purveyors of this we find in Carl Sagan and his protege, Neil deGrasse Tyson. We find in those who are producing all sorts of art forms. We see them expressed, as you mentioned, in museums and aquariums. And so when it comes to to cycle back to the idea of the greening of the world's predominant religions, there are also some beliefs that modern people tend to leave behind. So, for example, if you have big and powerful gods or a god, it's understandable why people with big gods wouldn't be that worried about environmental issues, because God is in control of environmental systems. So nothing happens that God didn't either make happen or permit to happen. And so if God wants to ameliorate or change environments and make them more beneficent to us, God can do that. And people with such views for millennia have been sacrificing plants and animals to appease or please those gods. Why? So that they can get environments that are favorable to them, and so that they can avoid those gods depriving them of favorable environments. So these are, sacrifice is absolutely central in the history of religion. And it's understandable how it could emerge and evolve. People are trying to, coincidences happen. People are trying to figure out how to shape the world in ways that are congenial to human existence. And so these practices emerge, and then they continue through time. But from a modern scientific perspective, these sacrifices that humans have engaged in for millennia, they don't affect whether climate changes that are negative, that negatively impact us and the rest of the living world, are occurring. Those are unrelated to our religious practices, with the exception of those religious practices that lead to directly or indirectly to environmental harms, right? And many of them do. If you just think about something as basic as the religious obligation to travel using infernal combustion engines to engage in religious ritualizing, that has a negative environmental impact. And people travel all over the world to go to pilgrimages, or they travel 1, 2, 3, or 4 times a week to their local church, temple, mosque, synagogue, and so forth. So basic things that people do have lead to environmental injuries.
Well,
Harvesting
especially using modern
palms.
technology.
Mm-hmm. Or
Right.
shipping palms from Mesoamerica to North America for Palm Sunday. I mean, there's interesting integrating fireworks into religious festivals, putting
World over. Yeah.
toxic statues of a sacred elephant, Ganesh, into rivers considered sacred, but that practice pollutes them. On and on and
Right.
on.
Right. And
Doing
a lot of
merit
that
releases of
is our
doing merit
religious.
releases of organisms into environments where they become invasive species to accrue merit, so you can have a better reincarnation. I mean, the list just is very long of religious ceremonies that lead to environmental injury.
And a lot of that is religion's attempt to adapt to modernity. And it's always struck me that often the challenge is not whether or not religions care for the environment, but like how is it that different religious groups are able to engage with economics and modernity as sort of being the critical question, like not do they care, but how do they engage with a system that makes it much easier to have a small plastic Ganesh than it is to do things in a more traditional fashion. And that leads to this, I think, this other question that I have, which is to in recognizing the tremendous role of colonization in leading to industrialization and environmental destruction. Where do you see, because I think the answer to this question is like really shifted over time, but where do you see the like ideas and actions around decolonization intersecting with the dark green religious movement?
In many ways, if we look back, for example, at the Earth Summit in 1990 in Rio de Janeiro, that was an early, profoundly influential moment where civil society came together, including many of the indigenous nations from the Amazon and elsewhere. They were kind of clamoring at the gates of these nation states who were meeting on environmental issues, demanding a seat at the table. It began earlier than that, but especially since then, there is what I have taken to call the global environmental milieu. And those are the spaces where people with very diverse backgrounds come together and wrestle with our environmental predicaments. Civil
So those are
society,
places
including
like
religious actors, have been increasingly involved in that.
and that
I'm sorry,
includes
go ahead.
those examples of those spaces are like the United Nations, environmental program conferences for the Earth Summit, the Gaian Foundation, the Earth Charter. Like there's many examples of organizations and civil society coming together to in the spaces that you're describing, and they're actually, I feel like they're happening all the time.
They are happening all the time, and part of what's happening is that people are encountering one another who previously had very little, if any, contact at all with one another. And some of the actors who have become increasingly influential there are those who have been the most colonized on Earth, and those we call indigenous peoples today. And many of those societies, as you know, have spiritual beliefs and practices that the term animism is an apt description for. And so these indigenous voices have helped to make it more credible, more acceptable for people to acknowledge their deep connections to non-human organisms and environmental systems. As you indicated a few minutes ago, you're hearing more often that people are self-identifying as animists. That's inconceivable without these decades of engagement of indigenous peoples and intellectuals within these sectors. And now we see people like Robin Wall Kimmerer, whose brilliant book, Braiding Sweetgrass, has become an international bestseller, and she just got that so-called MacArthur Fellowship, or AKA Genius Award, and she's exceptionally influential. And
Yeah,
you have someone
absolutely.
like Richard Powers, who wrote The Overstory and won a Pulitzer Prize for it, really writing an animist book. And this is on the back of previous animist bestsellers like Daniel Quinn's Ishmael.
And the work of
So
someone like David Abram
and David Abram, who is,
yeah.
an anthropologist and philosopher, well known for promoting animistic perceptions and
Yeah, as you're
worldviews.
describing that, I'm thinking of how many people I know who are trying to how many people from settler backgrounds are trying to find language to describe their own journey away from a colonial mindset and towards greater indigenosity, and the incredible challenge of actually naming that as indigenosity, as they themselves are not indigenous, and looking for
Mm.
language and looking for like practices that will connect them to their own non-Christian, non-colonial ancestral roots, or just different practices that will take them out of that position of the colonizer, both spiritually and practically. And I'm wondering if that's actually part of why animism as a container has grown. And because there's folks who I would have thought of, more might have used pagan terminology, and they're not, because they don't want to associate themselves with a particular European religious system, but they do want to associate themselves with this with the life force of all beings and their connectivity to it.
Sure. Paganism continues to be a fraught term in the West after millennia of suppressing and viewing pagan spiritualities as spiritually and politically dangerous. I remember Gary Snyder, the Pulitzer Prize winning poet, who wrote this stunningly remarkable book, Totem, Turtle Island, in I think 1969, won the Pulitzer Prize for it. He expressed, and I've interviewed him decades ago, and he is one of the foremost proponents of two things. One, an animist spirituality, but also, in a way, becoming indigenous. He and others were pioneering this term about re-inhabitation, which is really about coming to see yourself as part of this place. And those of us who are more recent immigrants to North America, in some ways that could be seen as akin to becoming indigenous again.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this is, of course, in the contemporary politics, and even back then, controversial in some ways, but nonetheless, it expresses a longing of people who are recent arrivals in North America, not just a longing, but also a perception, that they have a spirituality of belonging to this place, that they do belong to this place, and they want to respect this place, and that in a way that's different than the way we use the term indigenous today, but nonetheless, there's a feeling of indigeneity that they themselves have. I call myself a native California. Well, that's it. And my felt identity is very much rooted in California. And indeed, right now, Jace Weaver, the wonderful Native American scholar, he did an excellent book on Mother Earth, and he's got this fabulous study of Red Atlantic. He's just one of the most erudite people I know. And he's written an essay on indigeneity for the inaugural issue of a new journal. I think it's just called Indigenous, and I'm going to be responding to that also, just kind of for this first issue, and just kind of wrestling with what's it like for people of a European heritage to wrestle with this term indigenous, when for many of us, we have developed deep respect for Native American traditions, indigenous traditions elsewhere. But we've also been, for quite some time, many of us, far from where many of our ancestors lived for many generations, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the human longing for belonging is a part of this struggle to understand how it is and where we fit in and where we belong. And it's not an easy, given the pernicious colonial history that has transpired, it's really hard to sort this out in a way that brings people together rather than divides them.
It is really hard, and I see people struggling greatly with language, for good reason. And I think that perhaps this leads to or can be a good segue to acknowledge that in the many different places that you are looking at, as the many different spaces that people are experiencing and expressing eco-spirituality in various forms, sometimes with language they like and sometimes not with language they like. What, in so many religious traditions, there is a sense of ordination, there's a sense of baptism, there is a sense of entry into and training within a religious tradition. That thing that you were mentioning at the very beginning about, the Christian folks in Southern California are actually quite good at bringing people into the fold, and giving them a sense of belonging. And I'm wondering, like, what I hear this question in many of the folks who I have had the privilege of working with, of what does it mean to go deeper into learning how to be learning the eco-spiritual path. And I'm kind of curious, like, what have you noticed in terms of people's process of entering into and developing leadership within a space that has so many different outlets and so many different aspects of so many different types of performance?
What a great question that is. Now, people are blundering their way toward trying to figure out forms of common ceremony that can provide rites of passage and felt community for people involved who have these kinds of perceptions and feelings and are trying to figure out how to work together. So when you think about ritual as something that is that evolves over time, sometimes ritual works, sometimes it doesn't. And traditions that are long-standing, over time, they develop forms that tend to work for people, right? Mm-hmm. And these newer forms of nature spirituality that are kind of that are very broad, that aren't rooted, for example, in a specific indigenous society, mm-hmm. There hasn't been much time to figure out or develop those things, and there's no priesthood. I mean, part of the dark green religion argument is there's all this stuff going on, and it's little recognized as something that is a global movement, something of a global spiritual movement. And I'll go back to the radical environmental stuff as an example of how difficult this is. So in that movement, which is fairly anarchistic, the de facto priests of the movement were the musicians and poets, and they were fabulous. They had powerful presentations in poetry, and they definitely did what religion and religious ceremonies do. They, at their best, they help to evoke or reinforce ecstatic experiences, the values of the tradition, bring people together, really help bond people together in loving kindness. And in addition to that, there was this process, which I suspect you've heard about, called the Council of All Beings.
Mhm.
This was
Right.
developed foremost by Joanna Macy, a Buddhist scholar and former Gandhian Sarvodaya worker, and John Seed, a Buddhist deep ecologist from Australia. And this involved a number of different processes that we probably don't have time to talk about, but it basically involves the act of moral imagination, imagining yourself in the live form of another species or another natural entity, and then talking as a council of all beings together about the way they're being treated by human beings, and then sometimes directly to kind of symbolically to human beings, expressing both fondness for them and anger at them for the way they're being treated on Earth, right? But overall, this process, which is usually a 2 or 3 day process, certainly in my judgment, in its most powerful, reinforces the spiritual and ethical perceptions and commitments of the people there, dramatically bonds the people who go through this, because this is together, which is a very emotional process for most of those who go through it. And at a time in these radical environmental meetings, at the annual meetings, there would be one of these every time. It would be an abbreviated one, like a 1 day one, but it functioned to create bonds that are very difficult to create in the kind of depth that these things do. Well, one of my theories about the fact that the movement has, despite the fact that it continues to do its activism, but for all sorts of reasons, it's a shell of what it formerly was. But one of those reasons is, in my judgment, that it didn't know what to do with the powerful spiritualities that were emerging organically within it. And because of its kind of anarchistic dimension, anyone who emerged with unusual kind of spiritual charisma was subject to having their legs cut off from under them. And I've talked to musicians within them. They have to kind of downplay, that they understand that their role is to do that. And the movement didn't, because of its fear of hierarchy, didn't do anything to really make sure that the organic power, spiritual power that had emerged within it was going to be repeated. Make sure your spiritual leaders are at the big events and that kind of thing. So I mean, it's understandable that suspicion of hierarchy.
Well, and suspicion of what is different types of power too, right? One can have charisma without having, and one can have spiritual leadership without moving into hierarchy.
That's right.
But that takes a lot of thought about how to do that well.
It does. And I mean, those who study religion know that religions are being invented all the time, right? They've been invented for a long time. Most of them die out. Sociologist Max Weber insightfully noted that those that survive do so because a process is developed to pass down the charisma in some way, the charisma of the original leaders. And that can either be through a hereditary lineage, like Shia Muslims, or it can be through a kind of a priesthood like the Sunni. Or maybe I have that reversed. I'll have to double check my notes. I don't want to, I just want to acknowledge I might have misremembered that. But in any case,
processes
in
are
these kinds
developed
of
and
new
they're passed
movements,
down.
in these kinds of movements, there's no established process for passing down the charisma. But there's all sorts of eco-spiritual productivity that's going on that works for people. But understandably, these movements are concerned about, so often hierarchy is involved in plutocracy and environmental degradation, right? So I don't know whether it's possible for there to be a more self-conscious development of things, processes that really work for people, and also at the scale that a profound religious movement needs to move even more rapidly,
Or
right?
even
So like
just at the process of raising children, for example. So if someone has a new child and they want to raise that child in an eco-spiritual community, like it's very hard to know where to go. Like they could sign up for local places to go walking, like, but that's not necessarily going to have a ritual format to it. Like, where are they going to what are they going to search on Google to find like the local,
right.
like
Well,
even as
there
simple
are
as
some.
something as simple as rearing children, like within this spiritual context.
That's right.
Yeah.
And I went. I wrote a 10-year retrospective on the Dark Green Religion book, and in it I mentioned two that was the forward to the German edition, and I published it elsewhere. But I mentioned two newly formed religious organizations that are attempting to do this. One is called Gaianism.
Mm.
It was founded by a former senior researcher at the World Watch Institute, and another was formed by an Australian. It's called Vita for religion, and these can be, people can Google these, and they're trying to create a kind of collective, group. Both are what I would call religious naturalists. In other words, they're not promoting belief in non-material divine beings, but they view the earth itself as sacred, and that ethical behavior involves both personal uh, efforts to reduce one's consumption so that the rest of the living world can live, but also political action to address the systemic insults to the biosphere. So there are examples of that. There's a Church of Deep Ecology. I don't think much has really come of that, but this impulse to rationalize the charisma, again, to borrow a phrase from the sociologist Max Weber, is out there. But we're only seeing it at its most early nascent stages, and who knows whether any of these recent efforts will catch on as they're currently being developed.
It's also interesting this is happening at the same time that so many, kind of like in parallel, but perhaps also in conversation, that so many indigenous folks here in the Americas are deepening their own, revitalizing their own spiritual earth honoring traditions, and including, but most particularly, revitalizing their indigenous languages. And I'm kind of curious, like, how language and identity is going to shape things, and how these cross-cultural conversations and occasional clashes are going to shape both spaces. I mean, as both groups are, some who are very deeply embedded in their spirituality and some who are not, or have lost many of their traditional practices due to colonization, how all these different groups will be able to, what processes they may develop both separately and together. Because I'm hearing from you there's a need for greater processes. People are sometimes finding each other and sometimes not. And there is a need for at the local level, for community gathering spaces in which practices can solidify and develop and nurture at relatively local levels, across these different spectrums, whether someone be in an organization like the UN, or whether they be a surfer, or whether they be a mountaineer, like, or whether they like the many different roles that people are playing, and where they're expressing their ethos, often at offices and workplaces and on the front lines of protests. The need for that kind of next step in a religious development.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one of the encouraging things is that over time, I think activists with settler backgrounds have, many of them have become better at kind of listening to their indigenous colleagues in respectful ways and engaging with them as partners. And that doesn't mean pandering and agreeing with them all the time, but when people are in relationship, authentic, respectful relationship, they don't have to agree all the time. And I've written about the delicate nature of this stuff, for example, in an article called Earth and Spirituality or Cultural Genocide, Radical Environmentalism's Appropriation of Native American Spirituality. Well, some of these practices, some of these efforts to draw on Native American spiritualities, as you well know, have been very controversial. But when people come together in common cause, who have a sense of the sacredness of planet Earth, it is not uncommon, and maybe it's even inevitable, that they would end up in shared ceremony, in shared prayer, however that might be understood. And indeed, that is quite common. So it's impossible to, at the grassroots, to avoid cross-cultural ceremony when it comes to particular campaigns, as we see it, places like Standing Rock and so forth. One example of this is that lawyers in the Mount Graham campaign, the effort to prevent telescopes being built on Mount Graham, which was considered a desecration by a number of native nations as well as by environmentalists for overlapping ideas. Well, the attorneys, some of the Native American folks, viewed that struggle as a spiritual battle and wanted to purify by smudging off the attorneys before they went into the courts, because they considered that to be a place of spiritual warfare. Well, I don't know all those attorneys, but I know some of them are not religious. I mean, don't share the metaphysical beliefs of the Native Americans, but it would have been bad manners to decline that or feel, to express awkwardness about that. So sometimes that's what I mean when I say that when one is in these contexts of concrete struggle, whether one shares the metaphysical and spiritual beliefs of one's allies, one still stands respectfully when someone wants to bring such practices forward. So these are, these relationships, these cross-cultural relationships that are so fraught with colonial baggage, they're difficult. But I think they are improving, in my judgment, over time through mutual learning.
And practice. More and more people having more and more conversations and talking about them and learning. Yeah, it's and I like your use of the phrase awkwardness. I feel like it is almost inevitable as we grow different spiritual practices and we seek eco-spiritual forms, that there's going to be a lot of awkwardness. But one of the things that your work really beautifully demonstrates, because you just sort of cataloging it with such a wide perspective, is the extent to which, with all the many obstacles and awkwardness, it is happening, and people are not alone in this process, and that there is something here that is far more than a small group of individuals or a small group of thinkers or writers or artists or surfers or people working in NGOs or people walking in the woods. It is a much, much bigger phenomena that we are in the hopefully very early stages of, in which we have a lot of work to do in it, and learning together in it, but to really just for everyone to take a moment to acknowledge that this landscape is big and is vastly changing and is very dynamic.
Indeed. I sometimes ask people to ask themselves, if you had been around when the great axial age prophets were teaching, Jesus and so forth, and you had listened to a sermon on the Mount, or sat at the foot of the person we now call the Buddha, would you have thought at the time, seeing the people there, what would you have thought about this person? Would you have thought that, I think in 2,000 or more years, a very large proportion of the human population around this, on Earth would be followers of this guru? My hunch is you probably wouldn't think that, even if you thought this is really interesting and I'm drawn to it. This is very cool. Now you think about a movement like this that I mean, if you look at the scientific revolution, Galileo, Copernicus, Alexander von Humboldt, Darwin, Muir, Leopold, and so forth. It's only a few generations really since this decentering of humans as the center of the universe and the center of the evolutionary process. It's really recently that we have been displaced, if we're paying attention, from the center of all value and life. We're just a speck in the universe on the only planet we know for sure that complex multicellular organisms exist. That's a tremendous privilege to be in that one place in space where that's happening. And what is difficult to see now and to think about is what's going to be the prevailing worldview in 500 years, 1,000 years, or 2,000 or 5,000 years in our species. And one thing I'm sure about, an increasing proportion of the human community is going to have spiritual and moral sentiments along the lines of what I've talked about in the Dark Green Religion book. And that, of course, the world's predominant religions are not going away anytime soon. But I think as a proportion, if you set aside birth rates as a variable, as a proportion, as more and more people become aware of what we can know for sure through our own ability to observe, as that is enhanced by our clever gadgets, that more and more people are going to have a more naturalistic understanding of the human place on Earth, its responsibilities to it, and maybe how exceptionally special it is, and to such an extent that it's understandable how even secular people cannot but call it sacred.
Thank you for that. I feel like you just went on a little journey of remembering and re-enchanting with us. So thank you so much, Bron. This has been a really beautiful conversation, and thank you for your work. For the decades of work and scholarship and thinking, and bringing ideas and people and resources together to help us all see these things better and see these things differently.
Well, I very much appreciate that. It's kind of you to say that, and I very much enjoyed talking with you and being with your listeners.
Thank you so much for listening to the Remembering and Re-enchanting podcast. If you are enjoying what you are hearing, please subscribe, share, and leave us a review. I am always happy to hear from you, dear listener, to continue finding ways to connect the disconnected and go deeper on your own journey of remembering and re-enchanting with your communities, your organizations, and your families. I invite you to check out our courses and other community offerings via the Sequoia Summit Bio website. You can also follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Though I must admit I spend much more time working with really amazing people than crafting social media. If you want to work with me one-on-one or bring me to speak at your organization or family office, you can find out more at sarahjelena.com.